Welcome, everyone. Is this the third session, Michael? Fourth session. This is the fourth session of the ENP study session series being jointly conducted by the Colorado 911 program at the Public Utilities Commission, the Colorado 911 Resource Center, and the Colorado 911 Training Standards Institute. And tonight we have Michael Berry, who's going to talk about 911 reliability and contingency planning. All of these sessions are being recorded and they will be posted on the Colorado 911 Resource Center website, which is co911rc.org. So I hope to see you there, checking out the other sessions if you haven't seen them. And you can also contact any of us, and our contact information will be at the end of this session so that you can contact us with any questions that you may have. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Daryl. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for session 4. My name is Michael Berry, and once more I have the pleasure of being your presenter for today. As we've mentioned in previous sessions, I highly encourage you to purchase your own copy or a Comm Center copy of the ENP study guide and download the ENP book of knowledge from NENA. Everything we're going to discuss comes straight out of the study guide, and there's so much more information in there as you prepare to sit for your ENP exam. These study sessions are a great supplement, but should not be your only source material. As Daryl mentioned, today's session is on 911 reliability and contingency planning. We're going to cover sections 2.9 and 4.2 through 4.6 of the study guide. Feel free to raise your hand, put a question in the chat at any time. We want to make sure that everybody's getting able to follow along and understand as we go. And of course, there'll be some question and answer time at the end. So reliability and contingency planning really comes down to how things are going to be going on your worst day in the comm center, at least from a technology standpoint. So the first thing we want to do is expand our definition and our perspective of a disaster beyond the actual event that you might think of. FEMA defines 4 phases in describing a disaster. Those are mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Remember those 4 phases. I can almost guarantee you will see those on the ENP exam. You may see some sources that talk about a 5th phase, but per NENA and FEMA, these are the 4 that you need to know. Starting from what you might consider the end, recovery means activities designed to restore service to its original level or better. Most of our attention is going to be on the other 3 phases, though. You may think that recovery is the end goal, but as you can see from the diagram, there's no start or end. There might be overlap, but you'll always be in at least one phase or another. So let's go back to the phase that many would call the start, mitigation. Mitigation means all activities designed to limit the impact of future disasters. And while there's plenty that can be done at the agency level in mitigation, a large piece of the mitigation pie starts with the 911 system providers. In sessions 1 and 3 of the ENP study group, we discussed some fundamentals of the 911 system. You've got your central and local or end offices, your selective routers, your ANI controllers. But technology can fail. You know that, I know that. So what can we do to mitigate or minimize the impact of those failures? One option would be to double your connectivity to set up what's known as a dual tandem environment. As you can see in this graph, if a 911 call can't be routed through a primary tandem for whatever reason, the call might be able to be routed through a secondary tandem automatically. We'll talk a lot more about that later. That secondary tandem will try reaching out through the primary tandem in case the issue is with the connection between the local office and that primary tandem. And if that also fails, that secondary tandem can pick up the slack and complete the routing to your PSAP. With or without this dual tandem connection, there are designs in place already in the 911 legacy system to allow for failover and continuity if sections of that legacy system go out. In the event of an ANI failure, for instance, essentially you'd start failing back down toward a basic 911 environment instead of our enhanced 911 environment. As you might recall from those earlier sessions, the difference is in the routing of the calls. If the system can't confirm things like the caller's location, route it to the right PSAP based on an MSAG or an ENS, the emergency number system, the call might be routed to a default PSAP based on the proximity to the central office. And there's one more level of failure that may occur in the 911 system that providers have mitigated against or mitigated for, depending on how you want to say it. And that is the no alley record. The ANI system is working, the call has left the local office, entered that tandem system, but if there are no matches, nothing to tell the selective router where to send the call, that's when you get these no alley record errors. In that case, the system will use what's called the NXX code of your phone number. It's the first 3 digits after your area code. Those are not randomly generated, which is why you'll see that same number over and over again for phone numbers in your area. But that isn't foolproof. With the laws around number portability, allowing people to take their phone numbers with them, even landline numbers, as long as you're in the same area code, you could possibly move your number from one part of the state well across to the other. As you can see in this diagram of Colorado, 970 covers a large area, as does 719. There's no way that NXX number, if you've ported it, is going to work properly. So hand in hand with that mitigation is planning and preparedness. The FCC, NTIA, phone companies, everyone involved in the designing and implementing of the 911 systems planned and implemented mitigation steps in creating those failover options to get the call to you. You, as the emergency number professional, can and should work with your providers to see what's been done in your areas. But you probably don't have a lot of control over those mitigation efforts, at least not directly. What you do have control over is planning for the hazards and disasters that may impact your center. And there are 3 categories of disasters you can and should be prepared for. First off, let me go back one. Skipped the slide too soon there. First off is your natural disasters, such as your severe weather, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, fires. You could plan for all of these, but certainly more emphasis should be placed on what's most likely for your center. For instance, there isn't a lot of concern about tornadoes and hurricanes in my area, but fires and floods are absolutely at the top of our list. Second category is environmental situations. These could be airplane crashes, explosions, localized contaminations or hazardous materials spills, loss of power or phone service to the area. And these are hazards that are not planned or malicious. They're typically due to things like accidents, equipment faults. But the third category, it's the one we typically think about a lot, is the human-caused events, either through carelessness or malicious intent. These are your arsons, sabotage, vandalism, or it could be cut lines or network overloads in your area. Things that a human had control over and caused, whether that's a backhoe slicing through a fiber line or a computer virus wreaking havoc on your systems and taking your CAD offline. There's a lot that can go wrong, and it might seem daunting trying to come up with all of them and scenarios around them. But the best thing you can do is good preparedness and mitigation before an event occurs. And it will. Something will happen in your center. But if you're prepared and you've taken steps to mitigate where possible, your path through the response and recovery phases will be much easier, potentially quicker. Because we're prepared, we're identifying our potential hazards and we're mitigating those hazards where possible. Let's look specifically at our 911 system. Regardless of the category, the details of the disaster being faced, NENA has identified 8 categories of 911 service interruptions specifically that we're preparing for. They're full or partial loss of service to your PSAP, loss of a PSAP facility, isolation of a central office, isolation of an end office, loss of a central office, loss of the tandem switch or selected router, loss of the database management system, and loss of the alley node. Now, something to note here that might help differentiate things is that loss of service and isolation, those key words, service and isolation, refer to the ability of the locations to talk to each other. It's about the connection between two areas of the system. Loss is about the building itself or the systems within that building. So let's go through each of these and see what they look like, how we can prepare, and how we can respond. You might notice some themes or some duplications. That's because essentially a lot of the times the end result for you is going to be very similar. So first up is full or partial loss of service to your PSAP, which involves a break in the communications into the PSAP. Again, it's about that connection between 2 points, but not necessarily a problem with the 911 system beyond your PSAP or a problem with your physical facility. Most likely, this is going to be a network error. Could be your cut telephone lines in your parking lot, someone tripping over a power cord in your server room, things like that. Depending on the nature of the service loss, it might mean a full outage of 911, or it could mean just a partial outage that impacts only some trunk lines or just alley data. And there are 3 primary steps you can do to prepare for a full or partial loss of service. First off, having an agreement with another agency for backup 911 services that defines the support, the responsibilities of both parties, and any financial agreements associated with that support. Most likely, you already have that. You have that backup center for the routing of 911 calls. Second thing you can do is designate an alternate routing location, a backup dispatch center of your own, in case of a service loss that prevents 911 calls from being routed to that backup PSAP. This is also a great opportunity to plan a full backup dispatch center for PSAP evacuations. And finally, it's important to prepare your SOPs, your standard operating procedures, with this service loss as one of the options that gets spelled out. Spell out for your staff who to contact, how to initiate alternate routing, who's going to staff an alternate location, and who's going to make those notifications. These SOPs should be reviewed annually and used as regular training materials for your staff, because eventually you'll have to use them in a response. And in response to a loss of service, your first step is going to be proper notifications. Your staff should know how to contact your service provider to ensure that they're aware of this loss of service and they're working to get you back in full service if it's an issue on their side. They should also know how to initiate that 911 rerouting, either to your partner PSAP or your alternate location or both. And of course, notifying your partner PSAP if you're going to be rerouting calls to them. Let them know that they're going to get some extra calls and not to try and forward them back to you. Next, follow those SOPs. That's why you created them and why you trained on them. Start relocating if you need to in order to get as many core services operational as possible. And this might mean splitting up your staff, having some stay at your PSAP and others relocating either to an alternate location or maybe even that partner PSAP to help lighten the load you're sending to them. And finally, when the loss of service has been corrected, start that recovery process. Bring your staff back into the PSAP, make sure your calls are being routed back to your center, and make the notifications that you're back online and everything's working again. Next up is a loss of the PSAP facility. And this means you can't continue operating from your building or your comm center. Whether it's been destroyed by a man-made or natural disaster, or just the threat of a disaster, your staff must evacuate. In either of these categories, the loss of service or the loss of your PSAP, your 911 calls will need to be rerouted either to your backup location if you have one, or to that failover partner center. In preparedness, you're looking at much the same process as the loss of your PSAP services. You want to establish an IGA with that partner PSAP, establish an alternate location, and maintain current SOPs and train on them. In this case, it's even more important to establish that alternate location because your primary location is out of commission. You have to evacuate and go somewhere. Response is also very, very similar there. You need to make your notifications, follow your SOPs until it's time to recover and move back into your center, with a little added wrinkle of relocating and coordinating your staff, possibly for an extended period of time. That's a big question in a lot of these, is what does it look like if that loss of service or loss of facility is going to be an hour or 100 hours? Might make things different, and you need to spell that out in your SOPs. Moving out from your PSAP and into the 911 system, our next category of service interruption is isolation of a central office. This occurs when the links between the central office, isolation being the service between, that final hop in the 911 system to your PSAP and the remainder of the communications network are interrupted. In this scenario, only 911 calls received from within that central office's service area can be completed through to you. And those calls will probably be routed through your PSAP's 10-digit lines, not your traditional 911 system, which also means they will not have any alley data. Particularly in your larger jurisdictions, you may be served by multiple phone company end offices that funnel 911 calls into that central office. And if those calls aren't able to make it to the central office, they'll be rerouted based on contingency routing plans to a secondary or backup PSAP that you've established previously during your preparedness and mitigation. And this may shock you, but the preparedness steps are much the same here, with a little added bonus. 911 calls cannot be routed out of the central office and into your PSAP through your 911 trunks, but the voice calls can be routed locally to admin 10-digit lines. This can be tricky though. As we discussed, those phone company boundaries are usually not the same as your agency jurisdictional boundaries. You need to work with your provider to make sure that designated 10-digit lines, whether that's in your PSAP or at an alternate location, is in the same coverage area as your central office. Because remember, they can only push their service within their jurisdictional boundaries, within their service area. The initial notifications in this kind of disaster scenario will probably come from the phone company to you. And because you prepared, they know where to reroute those 911 calls to your designated 10-digit lines. At this point, your center should be following your SOPs, including staffing an alternate location if needed, and making any internal notifications until the phone company notifies you that their services have been restored. And like the isolation of a central office, you could have an isolation of an end office, which means that buildings or parts of the phone company system cannot connect outside of their areas before reaching the central office. Calls cannot make it over to the central office and to the selective router. And like the isolation of the central office, any 911 calls received in that end office service area can only be completed and routed to a call on a 10-digit line within that building's service area. Depending on your service area makeup, there may not be another PSAP within that area, which means either the 911 calls are not going anywhere, or your telecommunicators will need to set up a backup center with phone line access and another location within that area. Once more, you might recognize some of the steps in this preparedness: establishing agreements with a partner PSAP for rerouting 911 calls if they're within that service area, or establishing an alternate call routing location within that service area if you can maintain another building there. And maintaining, of course, thorough standard operating procedures and training on them to prepare you for this eventuality. In response, start relocating your staff to that alternate call routing location in that end office's coverage area so that calls can be routed to them on a 10-digit line. Make sure you notify the phone company if they aren't already aware and notified you, and keep them and your partner agencies updated on how they can contact you and where to route your calls. And of course, as soon as service is restored, start your recovery process according to what you've outlined in your SOPs, including bringing your staff back home to your comm center. Now that we've talked about isolation, we're going to get into loss. Next up is the loss of the central office. And that means the equipment within the central office has failed. Could be a malfunction, could be a fire, whether intentional or not. For whatever reason, the equipment in that building is out of commission. All telephone services within that area, 911 and otherwise, are gone. Calls from outside the area, like those routing through an end office, can still be routed to an alternate PSAP, but nothing is going to happen inside the central office's service area. In this category, it'll have a pretty severe impact on services. You can use a little more planning and proper preparedness for this. Certainly, you still need those SOPs, specifically your emergency operations plan. Within that emergency operations plan, we need to prepare for alternate communication needs because landline phones are out for the entire central office service area, including all of your incoming lines, not just 911. Some options for you, including having backup cell phones in your center, because cellular providers probably are not going to be impacted by this, only your landlines. Reaching out to news media to get the information out to the public, letting them know that 911 might not work for them, and giving them some options. Does your center use an over-the-top text to 911 system that doesn't rely on your phone provider, meaning it goes through an internet web browser? Can your center receive texts to your admin line? Or do you have an online form submission on your web page? Again, through an internet service that isn't connected to your phone system. Perhaps you have amateur radio service group in your area that can help set up contact locations throughout your community instead of phone lines. If the phones are out, what other options are available for you? Let's get them prepared and mitigate the impact. You'll probably get notifications from your service provider for this, which hopefully you've prepared for a way for them to contact you since they won't be calling you. I've been working during the loss where an officer came up on the radio to say he wasn't able to call in. And we started looking around at each other like, we haven't received a phone call in a while. Gets you started into that notification process. What's going on? Let's reach out to the phone company. Regardless, once you know, start working through those prepared and trained procedures. Make your notifications to your command staff, media, your amateur radio groups, whoever you've prepared to work with during this loss. And if you have a designated alternate call routing location, start relocating at least some of your staff to start taking those calls that can be rerouted through other end offices through that 10-digit line. And finally, keep following those SOPs and plans until that central office is back in service. And you can start working toward recovery and bringing people back in. Next up is loss of the tandem switch or selective router. And this is a failure specific not just to the building, but the equipment within that building. If the selective router is down, the system can't check the ANI system and won't know where to route 911 calls, won't be able to transfer calls between PSAPs within the 911 system. As we mentioned earlier in the mitigation section, ideally your center is being served by a secondary dual tandem if possible, and that can take it over and you'll never have this issue. That's one option to explore during the preparedness phase. And certainly, we've beat a dead horse mentioning to have a designated rerouting location, an alternate call location established ahead of time with either your partner PSAPs or an alternate building that you can house. And of course, have those SOPs written out. More importantly, use them to train your staff so that they'll be prepared for this. In your response, if you haven't figured it out, hopefully your provider is making those notifications to you about the loss and giving you regular updates. Implement those SOPs, including your internal notifications and notifications to your partner PSAPs, so they know to expect some default call routing going to them and then won't be able to transfer back to you. Keep working it until that tandem switch has been repaired and you can recover. Next up is the loss of the database management system. Again, a specific equipment failure. that being the database or the building housing the database that's being used. Depending on the nature and the extent, your center should continue receiving 911 calls in this kind of outage, but it might come in without any ANI or ALI data. Possibly even it could be seeing old data from a backup system. The system is just up enough to get the call through, but without some of the enhanced data. So to prepare for this, of course, we want to see those SOPs being developed and trained on. Know your phone provider contact information, both for the notifications, but also because in this kind of outage, you may still be able to run manual ALI retrievals in an extreme emergency situation by calling them and giving them a phone number. This doesn't mean you're contacting them for every 911 call, because neither you nor they have the time and resources for that. But what you might be able to do is have a local backup. Get a periodic snapshot of the ALI database that you can house within your system and create an internal procedure for running lookups against that. Keeping in mind, 911 calls are still coming in, just most likely without their ALI data. Your 911 provider should be notifying you. You can reach out to them for your manual lookups. But through all of this, follow your SOPs. And there might be some local laws that restrict the use of ALI lookups. So make sure you're aware of those and follow those. And finally, you're assessing the incident in question to know whether or not you should. Finally, there's the loss of the ALI node itself. As you might recall, 911 calls are following two paths on the way to your center. There's the voice path and the separate ANI-ALI data path. Loss of that ANI node means no ANI-ALI data, including the loss of any ALI rebid requests. It might also result in misrouted 911 calls, either due to bad ALI data or default routing when it doesn't get the answer it expects. Here again, that mitigation and preparedness effort could have included a dual tandem system with independent ALI nodes, in which case the secondary system can take over and your center might not be impacted. If it is, have those SOPs ready. Train them into your dispatchers on how to handle these kinds of calls. And keep handy and up to date your phone provider contact information, again, for notifications and those ALI lookups. Like with the database loss for your response, 911 calls are still coming in. They'll just be limited or no data involved with them, or they could be misrouted. Your 911 provider should be notifying you, and you can reach out to them for that manual lookup, following your SOP or any local laws that might restrict that. Big takeaway from all of these categories and scenarios: know these 4 phases and understand that the more effort you put into mitigation and preparedness, the easier time you'll have in response and recovery. Have an alternate or overflow routing partner. Know who that is and where they are, and especially in terms of your phone provider's system offices. We tend to focus a lot of the overflow routing scenarios on if our center is taking too many calls, like a major traffic collision and everyone's calling 911 from their cell phones. But that same routing, that same preparedness is what the phone companies will use for some of these other scenarios, like isolations of their central office. Also, know what triggers that overflow and contingency routing. There's typically a combination of factors. Certainly, when you receive too many calls and there are no available 911 lines, that should trigger your overflow. But what about the loss of your PSAP facility, where your telecommunicators have evacuated? Unless you have some way to manually indicate all circuits are busy, your phone company won't know, and those calls will keep coming into an empty room. Find out your center's process. You'll probably have a make busy switch, or it might be called a PSAP abandonment device, and know how to use it. Know how to manually indicate that those calls need to be rerouted. In the legacy and a transitional next-gen 911 system, your center probably has an agreement with one other PSAP to route all of your calls in an overflow or abandonment situation. In a true next-gen 911 system, we should get the option to have rotating calls between multiple centers or routing calls based on the geography of where the call was coming in from, so that you can split that workload, split those calls. So it's hit the fan, as they say. We're evacuating. We've got a loss of our PSAP facility. A disaster has happened, and this is where the rubber meets the proverbial road, where we find out if our preparedness, our mitigation are working for us. And because we are prepared, we've spent a lot of time in that preparedness and mitigation phases. We've looked closely at and created some important documents for ourselves. The first thing we looked at and learned from is NENA's informational and standards documents, especially NENA's INF 017.3, the PSAP Disaster Contingency Plan. You probably also read through the U.S. Department of Transportation's Next Gen 911 Procurement Toolkit, which has a section on continuity planning as well. You used those informational documents as guides to help you create your own SOPs, an emergency operations plan, which might also be called a business continuity or continuity of operations plans. In these plans, you've worked out, at least generally, guidelines for what your core mission critical operations are and how you plan to continue those services during a wide range of disasters. Day in and day out, your center probably handles a lot of duties, but during a disaster, you need to prioritize. What are the 3 or 4 essential functions you must do as a PSAP? Answer 911 calls, absolutely. Run NCIC queries? Maybe. Monitor license plate reader cameras? It's probably going to fall off your list of essential duties during a disaster. And that planning, those SOPs, that emergency operations plan, will help you spell that out. So you've established an alternate location, perhaps a fire station or another county-owned facility. You've determined what equipment you'll need. Maybe your call handling vendor has a remote laptop option. You've spelled out who will be responsible for making notifications, how you might adjust work schedules, and how quickly various tasks need to be performed as soon as the decision is made to evacuate. The more prepared you are with all of these possible scenarios, running down the whole laundry list of what may or may not happen and how you'll react, the more you train on these scenarios and how often, the more you know, the more you plan, the better your staff will be when that disaster occurs and the less impact and stress it'll cause. One more resource to bring to your attention is the Telecommunicator Emergency Response Task Force Initiative, or TERT. This is a joint initiative of NENA and APCO to help prepare and mitigate staffing challenges faced during a disaster. We place so much emphasis on the equipment that staffing and the toll they take during a disaster response can sometimes be overlooked. During a disaster, TERT teams, coordinated through state-level coordinators and FEMA, can be called upon to step in and assist you. These are specially trained dispatchers that can travel across the country to help supplement dispatch centers, letting your people take a day off, handle family needs, ease some of the workload, and generally be a person for the day. And of course, the better your SOPs and your EOP documentation, the easier it will be for them to get up to speed and effectively assist in your center. Final thoughts. Take advantage of all the resources that you can during your preparedness phase. We mentioned a couple earlier, but there are so many more. Take your online FEMA ICS training courses. Read NENA's informational and standards documents, and reach out to other centers to see what they're doing to prepare and mitigate, and certainly look for their after-action reports to see how other agencies actually handled disasters and what they learned from them. And that went really, really fast. But I am absolutely open to questions, looking to clarify anything that you would like me to go over again. Certainly readdress if we need to go back over something.
Thank you, Michael. Does anybody have any questions for Michael? Michael was very thorough. I think the only thing I would add, just from personal experience, because before I came to Colorado, I managed a 911 center in New Mexico. We had one central office in the county, and we had 4 remote central offices. So those remote central offices were basically connected off of the main central office for the county. And I think while I was there, we experienced every type of outage there was, where we had remote central offices that were isolated. We had the central office that was isolated. We had the central office went down so that it couldn't even reroute calls to a local 10-digit number. And one thing I learned is that the difference, and I've learned, I've seen lots of examples of this since then, is that what happens when that central office goes down or gets isolated really varies depending on what the situation is in terms of other carriers and how they are connected to the rest of the world. Especially in the rural areas, I think it's really common for wireless carriers to route their calls through that central office. So, you think of CenturyLink as a competitor to these wireless companies, but they're also partners. These companies will pay CenturyLink to route their calls through the central office. And that's kind of a worst case scenario for us, because it means that if the central office goes down, you don't just lose landline, you lose or the ability to receive 911 calls on your 911 lines. You also lose wireless, you also lose internet. It means all of the gas station pumps go down because they require an internet connection to process the credit cards. So what actually happens when that central office gets isolated will vary depending on what the exact situation is in your area. So if you're a PSAP manager, or you ever are a PSAP manager in the future, I think it's really good to talk to the local exchange carrier, which in most cases is CenturyLink in Colorado, but there are a few others out in the rural areas. Talk to that local exchange carrier and find out what other services are going through that central office, because if that central office becomes isolated, it'll be good for you to know, okay, does that mean we're going to lose all the wireless providers, maybe some of the wireless providers, maybe we'll lose internet, maybe we won't. And if there are providers that don't go through that central office, it might be good to get a phone from them as well, so that you have at least one working phone in the PSAP. And I know a couple of PSAPs in Colorado have specifically done that, purposely went out and found a company that did not go through the CenturyLink central office, so that if their main lines go down, they at least have one phone number or one phone in the center that they can use to talk to the rest of the world. So just a few things to think about. But yeah, Michael, you did a great job. And while I've been talking, has anybody come up with any other questions?
You, Daryl, just talk about like how many central offices are in like the Denver metro area, just so I can get an idea about what we're talking about?
Oh gosh. Well, typically you see one central office per county. It's not an exact one-to-one scenario, but through most of the state, you're going to see about one central office per county. But in Denver, in the Denver metro area, especially when you get close to Denver, they have more central offices, because one central office can handle a certain number of phone numbers. So they have more central offices, and that also provides them with additional redundancy. So if one central office goes down, that they don't necessarily lose phone service in those highly populated areas where they have the most customers. But I know, for instance, I think Denver itself has 3 central offices. But you get outside of that core population center, it's more likely that you're going to have one per county. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
And so like the PSAP I managed in New Mexico, that was San Juan County, New Mexico, not a highly populous county, but more than a lot of the really rural areas in the state. We had one central office for a county that was 5,600 square miles, but then they had 4 different remote central offices coming off of that, because it was such a big area geographically. Anybody else? Well, thank you, Michael. And if anybody thinks of a question later, feel free to reach out to Michael or myself or anybody on this slide. These are Jennifer and I work for the 911 program at the Public Utilities Commission. Connie works for the Colorado 911 Resource Center. And Monica Million, I think a lot of people know, she used to work for the Resource Center and now she's a private contractor. But all four of us helped put together the class plan for these sessions. So thank you to Michael for being our instructor tonight. And with that, I hope to see all of you at the next session.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Daryl.
Thank you.